Caryn Scotto D'Luzia, somatic therapist and author of the Alchemy of Shame Transformation book, and I have the pleasure of speaking with Peter Levine, who has written the seminal book Waking the Tiger and the founder of the breakthrough body-based trauma resolution model, somatic experiencing, that has helped so many people all over the world. Peter, it is such an honor to have an opportunity to speak with you today as one of the greatest pioneers of somatic therapy.
Shucks. Thank you.
It's good to see you, as always. I wanted to talk to you about shame, because that seems to be a topic that a lot of us work with our clients, and it's very rewarding when it works well, and it can be very tricky when we're working with it. I'd like to read to you what Stephen Porges gave as a definition of shame. Of course, Stephen Porges, the author of the polyvagal theory. And according to Porges, he says, shame is a parasympathetic break in an excited state, a fast-track physiological response that can overwhelm higher cortical function. How do you interpret that? Can you interpret that for us?
Well, we start with the first hour.
Well, just generally, how do you see that in clients when you're working with them?
First of all, I think there are two different distinct types of physiological pattern of shame.
Okay.
One is the agitated shame, and that you see the child's like this and they're looking away, but they're still like this. Or then there's the full collapse shame.
Right.
And I think what Steve is talking about when he talks about the excited state and then the parasympathetic, that's the agitated shame state. And that's actually easier to work with because there's more energy to it. Shame is one of the basic biological responses that social animals need to organize into groups, into hierarchies. It's also what lets the little one know that something is really bad and shouldn't be done again. So if the 2-year-old starts putting his fingers, the 3-year-old putting his fingers in his little baby sister's eyes, you need to stop that right away.
Right.
And so this is a response that stops everything that's in action. It's a break, as Stephen Porges says.
Right.
And now the problem is when shame has become chronic, when shame isn't repaired. See, shame is meant to be repaired. So, no, don't do that again. And then the child goes like this. It just, you see. And sweetheart, you can't do that. But it's not that you're a bad person. We love you. And they get the hug. And it gets repaired. Unfortunately, that often is not the case. And the child is left with this repetitive physiological state, which is very similar to what you see in the shutdown with trauma. And I think that's one of the reasons, actually the physiological reasons why trauma often is associated with same states, because they have a similar psychophysiological patterning.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, that really makes sense. You are one of the first people that I've ever heard talk about the connection between shame and disgust. And it seems really important. And can you explain that connection a little specifically right now?
Sure. Disgust, it probably originates, again, with a biological function. So if you taste something that's bad, not only if somebody else tastes something or eats something that's bad and they start to vomit, all the people around feel that same level of disgust, and the function is to get that out, whatever it is that you ate, or not to eat something in the first place. Now, when shame, so in other words, you're getting rid of something that shouldn't be inside, and that's disgust, getting that out. So in shame, when the person is habitually shamed, is chronically shamed, they are taking in that badness. And so disgust is, in a sense, the biopsychological way that people begin to get out that shame. It doesn't belong in me. I'm not a bad person. And often disgust is a gatekeeper to other emotions such as shame, such as sadness, such as anger. Because often disgust is, blah, wait a minute, that doesn't belong with me. A lot of times when children are shamed, they're shamed by someone who is doing a shameful thing. And so what they're saying is, wait a minute, the shame belongs to what you did to me, not how I feel.
So I'm hearing you talk about the externalizing it, externalizing the feeling of the disgust or the shame. Is that
right? In other words, you've internalized it.
Yes.
So the antidote is to externalize it.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. How about seeing it back at its source? There's a lot, people write a lot about seeing shame return back to its source, whether it's a parent or a school teacher or whoever did the shaming. How do you feel about?
What do you mean return to the source? I'm not sure I understand the question.
If you're working with a client in a session and they suddenly remember re-experiencing a shaming that happened in school, say maybe first grade, and they remember the teacher in front of the whole classroom sort of
humiliating them.
Humiliating them basically, which there's a close connection between shame and humiliation. I mean, in the work, that sense of not only externalizing but saying, well, that teacher was the one who really owns this feeling, not Peter
who it belongs
necessarily.
to.
Yeah, who it belongs to.
Right, the child just made a mistake, or the child didn't know an answer.
Right.
It wasn't that they're a bad person again,
Right.
and the teacher is shaming them and humiliating them. Humiliation is a form of chronic shaming. Shame has a biological function, again, to keep us from doing things that interfere with the social group. Mm-hmm. Humiliation is valueless. It only breeds corrosive emotions.
How about, that brings me to the question of the blame game in a session. So just give you an example. You're working with a client and you have a good rapport and you're making good progress. You've been making good progress over a number of months. And then they come into your office and suddenly they're sort of blaming you, seems like, for everything, including the fact that it's a rainy day. And it just kind of feels like you're playing a blame game. What is that pointing to, and what are some ways of working with that?
Yeah, well, it's another fairly complicated question, and of course it's not a matter of if but when. We try to explain to ourselves how we're feeling, and often that becomes externalized as blaming somebody else. Now, the person may have been making good progress, getting good feelings. Now, remember, there's no way you're going to get good feelings without there also being the swing to the other side, which is some kind of a bad feeling. And again, well, if the person, look at it this way, if the person is really lauding the therapist for helping them get at the good feelings, then a good therapist says, well, granted, I was your guide here, but this is something that you did. Because if it became something the therapist did, then when you're feeling cruddy, then it's the therapist's fault that the sun's not shining.
Right.
So that's something you can maybe get at the pass.
It kind of brings me to this question of need-based shame. And what I mean by that is the embarrassment that comes up, whether it's in children or adults, when they have needs. And sometimes that particularly can come up around being ill or aging, and suddenly there's this big embarrassment and apology over, I'm sorry that you have to move the chair or that we have to do this or that. And I'm just sort of, I'm wondering, because we often see need-based shame as some kind of attachment wounding. I wonder if you see it in that way, and if you do see it in that way, when we work with it, are we working first with attachment And then with the shaming, or how do you even see the need-based shame kind of piece?
Well, I'm going to insert something here first.
Good.
Not shyness.
Huh.
And shyness is a natural developmental phase of vulnerability, and also the feeling that someone, the adult, the parent, can see through you, see into you. And that can evoke a disgust or shame or a disgust response, because they're seeing inside your viscera, inside your gut. But the shyness itself is part of spontaneity.
Wow.
So it either goes in that direction, as in terms of spontaneous playfulness, or if the parent is penetrating, I don't mean necessarily sexually,
Yeah.
but penetrating with their attention, then that can turn into shame. And a lot of times when people feel the spontaneousness, they then fall back into shame. And in other words, they don't get, wait a minute, this is actually a good feeling. This is a healthy feeling, a salubrious feeling.
That's really fascinating. I'm trying to think in a session, if I was working with someone in a session and that came up, where they kind of felt like there was a way that they were being penetrated in some shyness.
Or being seen.
Yes, or being seen. How I would sort of work with that so that it didn't fall in the shaming side, but into that more of that spontaneity and the flow of it.
That's right. Well, I think that's the key right there, is to be able to access that playfulness. The playfulness, yeah. And to appreciate the shyness. When you see 4-year-old kids and they're going like this is like, whoa, aren't I just great? And that's, and that's when the parent could be, yes, you are great. You are great. And by the way, you still have to eat. You still have to eat your spinach.
Yeah, you still can't pull your brother's finger off or something.
Yeah, all of these kind of things.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it kind of moves me into a question that I wanted to ask you about proprioception. And I know that you recently published an article through Dartmouth on research that...
Well, through Frontiers, consciousness, psychology consciousness, yeah.
Yeah, and the base of that was the link between proprioception and healing trauma, am I right?
Yes.
So I'm just thinking about that because you're talking about the playfulness in a session, and I wonder if we can apply that idea of clients using different proprioceptive methods also with shame and the shame resolution.
Right. Again, you have to be careful about that, because if you just have the person go into their body when they're feeling shame, they are very likely just to collapse into it. So one of the tools I find to be very helpful is to have the person become aware that their eyes are averting, that their eyes are looking away and down, that their shoulders are kind of slumped over, and then to guide them, to lead them through an exercise where, okay, as you notice that, and if you just let it increase just a little bit, what would that look like? What would that feel like?
Yeah.
And then what would it look like and what would it feel like when it begins to turn around and go in the opposite direction? So you're going into the shame posture, physiology, and then out of the shame physiology posture, moving back and forth. And then you're pendulating, you're shifting so you don't get stuck in it. And then, because that's the problem with shame. Shame itself isn't the problem, it's getting stuck in shame. And a lot of times children aren't respected. And that is an injury. And that is a deep injury.
Yeah, loss of dignity.
Loss of dignity. That's right, because children deserve dignity. People observe.
All
All
beings,
people
all beings do.
deserve dignity.
Yeah.
And when again a child is just shamed and shamed, you're taking the dignity away. You're taking that underpinning of what it means to be a self with other selves.
Yeah, I love that about your work. I love that you speak about dignity, and when I watch you work with people, that you actually work with that issue of, of dignity. It's just so moving and touching to me. And I think it's a huge, huge piece that's missing in a lot of therapeutic approaches and...
Gosh, I hope not.
Well, sometimes it is, but I really
Yeah.
love that being key. That actually brings me to a question. It kind of ties into what we're talking about right now. Very often in somatic schools of movement, they will talk about the authentic self is movement. And I see that yoga and dance can be very therapeutic for chronic shame survivors. And I'm wondering if you see that connection there, and if there's any pitfall into viewing that as being reparative, the movement itself as being, the authentic.
Well, indeed. Look, when a person is traumatized, that's something that the body does. The body stiffens, the body retracts, the body constricts, the body collapses into helplessness. These are all things that the body does, right, in trauma or in shame. What we need to help people do is find new bodily experiences that contradict those of shame and helplessness and freezing and contracting. And movement is a good avenue for that. Now again, it's not just movement, but it's movement with awareness of the movement, of finding really the inner movement. And it's the inner movement that I believe takes people towards a reconnection with the authentic self. And that's not the ego. That's not the ego, the self in the ego with a small s. It's the purposeful intentionality of the organism in its movement through life that is the authentic self.
I think it's a really brilliant part of your teaching when you teach about inner movement. And it took me a little while to understand what you meant. And I hope and I feel like I do now, but can you give a concrete example in a session of how you would distinguish inner movement for someone? So we're having a session, I'm sitting there, and what would be an example of
Well, let me give an example of the way things used to be done, for example, in psychodrama or certain types of Gestalt. So you'd be working with a client, and they would be making some kind of a gesture. And often the therapist would say, well, exaggerate that. Right? And you would exaggerate it. And now really exaggerate it and make some sounds. Now really, really exaggerate it. So it goes towards a catharsis, towards an escalation. Now, for some instances, it's useful to help a person get in contact with their emotive expressive feelings.
Yeah.
But what really takes people deeper is when they find out where that movement comes from on the inside. And that's why proprioception and kinesthesis are so important in restoring the self, because it's in those inner movements. Oh, okay. So instead of just clenching my fist and opening my fist and being really angry, what's it feel like when I open and when I close? And then when I open, wow, that's interesting. I feel my chest expanding right now. So one sensation leads to another, to another, and to another, and that's what you find in the uncovering, the discovery of the authentic self movements. And there are movement systems, for example, that really focus more and more on the inner movement, such as authentic movement. That's even called authentic movement.
Yeah. I'm also thinking about inner movement in the sense of your concept in somatic experiencing of energy wells and the energy being held in certain places and also in certain dimensions, let's say, certain parameters. And I don't know how you want to explain energy wells, but I'm thinking about in terms of
Again, you got to give me like an hour at least.
Yeah, but I'm thinking about the connection between shame being a contracted state and the energy kind of contracting intensely. And as we work with folks to unpack that shame, that maybe that importance of the energy wells comes in. Because if people just sort of go from that very contracted state, maybe I'm wrong, maybe you don't agree with that, but to a very sort of like, oh yeah, I have all this pride, that might be too much of a jump in terms of energetically. I never see that being very sustainable when people go from the one extreme of shame to the very sort of polar opposite.
Well,
I'm wondering if
I tend to agree with people who have strong opinions, so I'll agree with you.
Does it harken back to your idea of energy well, or is
Well,
something
I think
else?
let's look at something maybe a little bit more simple.
Okay.
Okay. The nervous system can only learn one small new thing at a time. And if you try to learn too many things, if you try to teach a nervous system, a body, too many things all at once, they tend to interfere with each other. And so, in that way, I think it's important to just take one little step at a time until it really becomes embodied, incorporated in the person's being, in their nervous system, in their development.
That makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. I'm glad you clarified that. I'm thinking about the work you did in Kosovo. I believe you were in Kosovo in 19...
Well, Croatia.
Oh, you were in Croatia. And you were working with trauma healing there, and you've been working with vets coming back from Iraq. And I wonder if shame was something that showed up in the work, in those kinds of combat and, post-conflict, and if, there was anything particular that stood out for you in terms of how you worked with those populations.
Yeah. Shame. Well, many times shame comes up because people perceive that they weren't not only able to protect themselves, but to protect their family and people from their villages and so forth. So often shame comes in that way. And again, in the military, you're not supposed to need help. And so if you feel helpless, then very often shame gets attached to that. Right? Because you're supposed to be strong, you're not supposed to need other people's help, but we do. And not only, we need each other's help when we're in the battlefield, right? And that's where most military folks are trained. You are family, and everybody's life depends on everybody else being by their side. And if something happens to somebody else, often a lot of shame is experienced around that. Feeling the vulnerability of losing friends, losing family, right? Because it's family. And it's just, you feel just such sorrow and grief. But because we're taught not to, in the military, we're taught not to have feelings, because you don't want feelings on the battlefield. That would only interfere with things, that would only get in the way of your functioning.
Yeah.
But then, because we're unable to feel them and process them, shame tends to fill that void.
Wow. The neurofeedback technology is something they've been using with vets and people that have had trauma and so on. And I'm just wondering what your sense is in terms of being able to create new neural pathways for things like acceptance and worthiness and belonging. you know, is it does it seem useful in terms of, you know, seeding the new positive?
Does neurofeedback seem useful? Is that what you're...
Neurofeedback, yeah.
I think so. I
Yeah.
think neurofeedback has a lot of potential and has been, you know, poorly utilized because, again, it's one of these things that's not accepted now on whatever it is, randomized, double-blind stuff. But I think it's valuable. I think it's very valuable for kids who are ADHD. And I think that should be tried before giving them these heavy medications, which many of these kids are on. And in a way, I see SE as a form of neurofeedback because you're picking up a lot of, the therapist is trained to pick up a lot of these very subtle shifts in the body and in the nervous system, and you use that feedback. But I think as a self-help tool, neurofeedback is very useful.
Yeah.
It's a very good mindfulness enhancer.
People talk a lot about mindfulness and how important that is for shifting so many things, including shame. And I think you would probably agree that it's a very powerful tool. But in the shame cycle, that downward spiral cycle that we were talking about earlier, sometimes mindfulness comes in too late, right? Because the cognitive mind is kind of hijacked.
Sure.
So in terms of how you would use or how you would think about using mindfulness with clients, and it's particularly connected to shame, would that be sort of pre and post, you know, like the shame attack? So
well, I think people are becoming more nuanced in mindfulness work. Mindfulness isn't just, you know, it's not like just meditating. It really is, I mean, I think that should legitimately be called embodifulness as well. Because, you know, if all you do is be aware of what's going on, if it has to do with trauma and shame, that's not going to change it. Just being aware is not enough. You have to find ways to shift it. And, you know, I was just presenting at a conference on mindfulness and compassion, essentially. And there were some of the really good people in mindfulness were there. A guy named Rick Hansen. And we had a really nice connection, and I was really pleased. I actually asked him a question during his lecture, and then the next slide he was answering my question. So we laughed about that. And because, again, it's you know, I mean, those of us who started working with the body in the 60s, you know, we're kind of glad to see that people are catching up.
Indeed, yeah.
But I think it's now a point where the body awareness is now becoming part of the whole mindfulness mindfulness understanding.
Well, my final question really looks toward the future, and it's kind of, you know, asking the question, do we humans still need shame? You know, as we evolve in this, our consciousness evolves and society evolves, can we replace shame with compassion and awareness, or do we need shame for accountability?
Well, okay, in the ideal world, right, where everybody's the Buddha,
right.
We don't have any use for shame. In the meantime, I mean, that's a hard one, right? You think of a time when you had an argument, you did something that was really a little bit cruel to a friend. And then you realize, oh my gosh, I'm sorry. I apologize for that. And that's important. And that's shame that gets you to apologize. Now, if you're totally aware of everything, well, you're not going to do that. But in the real world, we're doing it all the time, and the question is whether we repair it. And I think that's an important thing that people learn in having a healthy relationship, is the ability to be vulnerable and to repair something that's done where you transgress on a person's dignity.
Mhm. And I guess having compassion for the self, when you've made that transgression, that's where the compassion comes in also.
That's right.
Right? Having.
Yeah. I mean, all compassion really begins with self-compassion, but we usually don't get to self-compassion until we are able to feel compassion from somebody else or somebody that had compassion for us. Then we're able to kind of, play the ins and outs of it and be compassionate to others.
Well, you have shown so much compassion to the world, Peter. I mean, your work is an amazing model, and I'm so grateful for it every day of my life. So, yeah, thank you for this time, this interview. It's been really rich and informative, and for the somatic experiencing model.
Okay, gladly.